If you grew up moving between two homes, two emotional climates, two versions of yourself, you may recognize this feeling, a quiet alertness that never fully turns off. Not panic, not fear exactly, just a low hum in the background, like a house where someone is always half expecting the lights to flicker. This isn't weakness, it's memory, stored not in words, but in the nervous system. Divorce often gets described as an event, a decision, a legal process. For a child, it functions more like a symbolic earthquake. The ground doesn't just crack once and settle. It teaches something ongoing and implicit, that stability is conditional, that what feels solid today might rearrange tomorrow. And when the ground becomes uncertain, the body adapts long before the mind can make sense of it. Many children of divorce go through an unspoken initiation. Without being asked, and often without realizing it, they become emotional translators. They learn to read tone before language, mood before meaning. They learn when to be quiet, when to be helpful, when to disappear a little so the room can breathe. This happens before they have words for feelings, before they have a map for what belongs to them and what does not. The skill looks like sensitivity. The cost is often invisible. Culturally, we like clean stories. We talk about successful divorces, about adults who handled things well, who stayed civil, who did their best. All of that can be true. And still, there can be a private cost paid inside the child's identity formation. Not because anyone failed morally, but because the child's psyche had to reorganize itself around divided loyalties. This reorganization is quiet. It doesn't announce itself as trauma. It shows up later as patterns. There is an old archetypal image that helps here: the divided kingdom. When a kingdom splits, the damage isn't only external. Loyalties fracture. Messengers learn to carry careful versions of the truth. Strategy replaces innocence. This isn't about character flaws. It's about survival logic. When love lives in two places that don't fully speak to each other, the psyche learns to split its attention in order to belong. You may have been told you were mature for your age, responsible, easy, the one who didn't cause trouble. That praise often lands warmly at first. Over time, it can harden into a role. And roles, when they form early, don't always ask for consent. They simply take over. If you notice yourself tracking other people's emotions more easily than your own, if peace feels strangely unfamiliar, or if you carry a sense that relationships require constant management, none of this points to something being wrong with you. It points to something that once worked very well. In Jungian language, we might say that an adaptive persona formed early. Translated into everyday terms, this means a version of you learned how to function, how to keep things together, how to stay safe by staying aware. The shadow here is not something dark or immoral. It's the parts of you that didn't get equal development, because vigilance took priority over choice. Take a moment, even now, to notice your body as you listen. Not to change anything, just to observe. Is there a subtle holding in the chest, a readiness in the jaw, a sense of leaning forward, even while sitting still? These are not problems to solve. They are signals of a system that learned early that attention mattered. We don't talk much about this because there's no obvious villain. There's no single moment to point to. And so the story gets internalized as personality. This is just how I am. But personality is often the surface expression of a much older strategy. Halfway through this conversation, we're going to expose a pattern that many men misread as temperament, or preference, or even destiny, when it is actually survival code still running in the background. Not to blame it, not to erase it, but to finally see it clearly. For now, let this land gently. What adapted you once may be asking for an update, and understanding how that adaptation began is not about reliving the past. It's about reclaiming choice in the present. There is often a quiet moment in childhood when safety stops feeling like something given and starts feeling like something earned. It doesn't arrive as a thought. It arrives as a shift in attention. A child notices that certain moods in the room require adjustment. That harmony depends on timing, tone, and restraint. Over time, safety becomes conditional, not because anyone declared it so, but because the nervous system learned that closeness followed performance. This is the hidden wound many children of divorce carry into adulthood. When the family structure fractures, the child's body learns to track emotional weather. Someone becomes sad, distant, overwhelmed, or angry, and the child adapts. They become helpful, quiet, reassuring, or unusually competent. What looks like maturity from the outside is often vigilance on the inside. In psychological language, this pattern is sometimes called parentification. In everyday terms, it means growing up with one eye always on someone else's stability. From a Jungian perspective, this is where the adaptive persona begins to fuse with early attachment regulation. The persona is not a mask in the sense of something fake. It is a functional interface with the world. When formed under pressure, it organizes itself around vigilance rather than choice. Identity becomes less about who am I, and more about what keeps things from falling apart. The self learns to earn safety by being useful. There is a paradox here. Responsibility feels like strength. It brings praise. It brings a sense of being needed. Over time, it can even feel like integrity. But often, this responsibility is fear-rehearsed until it looks like virtue. The body learned early that being attuned prevented loss, and so attunement becomes constant. Not a skill that can be used, but a posture that cannot be put down. This pattern appears across cultures, even though the stories differ. In many Western families, the good child is the one who copes, who doesn't add stress, who understands more than they should. In many Eastern families, maturity and self-sacrifice are praised openly, often framed as honor or duty. In both cases, the nervous system can remain in overdrive while the behavior receives approval. The child is celebrated for holding it together, while their own internal experience goes largely untranslated. What rarely gets named is that this early contract doesn't disappear. It mutates. The rules shift, but the logic stays the same. When intimacy enters the picture later in life, the old agreement quietly reasserts itself. Connection feels safest when one is monitoring, managing, anticipating. Love becomes something to maintain rather than something to inhabit. Many adults who grew up this way describe a strange internal pressure in relationships, a sense that if they relax, something will go wrong, that closeness requires effort, that peace must be watched carefully. These experiences are often mistaken for personality traits, being conscientious, being emotionally intelligent, being the stable one. And again, none of this is wrong. It is simply incomplete. There is also grief here, though it is rarely recognized as such. Grief for a childhood where safety was ambient rather than negotiated. Grief for spontaneity that never fully formed. This grief tends to stay underground because the narrative of responsibility leaves little room for loss. After all, nothing terrible happened, and yet something essential was postponed. If you listen closely, you may notice that this early contract still speaks in the background of adult life. It might sound like an internal voice that scans for problems before enjoying connection, or a subtle tension that arises when someone else is unhappy, even when it has nothing to do with you. These are not signs of failure. They are echoes of an agreement made before there was another option. 2 chapters from now, this pattern will be tested against a real survivor's account. Not to dramatize it, and not to assign blame, but to flip a familiar story on its head. What often gets labeled as too much or not enough will begin to look more like coherence under pressure. For now, it's enough to recognize that this early contract was intelligent. It kept things together when togetherness felt fragile. The question that slowly emerges is not whether it was wrong, but whether it still deserves exclusive control over how closeness is lived today. As adulthood unfolds, the early contract doesn't announce itself as history. It reappears as attraction, as tension, as a familiar pull toward certain emotional configurations that feel strangely alive. Many men notice this pattern only after repetition sets in. Different faces, different circumstances, and yet the same internal choreography begins again. From the outside, it can look like poor partner choice or unresolved preferences. On the inside, something subtler is happening. The psyche is organizing loyalty around an old division. One partner unconsciously becomes associated with the parent who left, withdrew, or became unavailable. Another role mirrors the parent who needed support, patience, or emotional rescue. These roles are not chosen deliberately. They emerge through projection, the mind's way of externalizing unfinished inner dynamics. In Jungian terms, projection is not a flaw in perception. It is an attempt at completion. What was never metabolized internally seeks expression externally. Trauma psychology adds an important layer here. Repetition is not driven by pleasure, but by the hope of mastery. The nervous system returns to familiar terrain not because it enjoys suffering, but because it recognizes the map. It knows how to survive there. This reframes a painful misunderstanding. Choosing emotionally unavailable partners is often interpreted as having low standards, poor boundaries, or unresolved self-worth. Yet for many children of divorce, emotional distance feels legible. It has contours. It has rules. There is something oddly calming about knowing where the edges are, even when those edges hurt. Availability, by contrast, can feel disorienting. Calm can feel suspicious. One adult man described this tension with striking clarity in a survivor thread online. In stable relationships, he noticed a low-grade anxiety that he couldn't explain. Nothing was wrong, yet his body felt restless, almost bored. In more chaotic connections, his system lit up. He felt focused, purposeful, needed. The intensity registered as chemistry, even though it came with exhaustion and eventual collapse. What he didn't recognize at first was that his nervous system was responding to familiarity, not compatibility. This is where loyalty wars quietly take place. The adult mind believes it is choosing freely, while the body is re-entering an old battlefield. The vigilance learned in childhood finds a stage. The role of emotional manager returns, and with it, a sense of meaning that is hard to relinquish. Being needed once equaled belonging. That equation doesn't dissolve simply because time has passed. What often goes unnoticed is the grief embedded in healthier connections. When chaos is absent, the old role has nowhere to land. There is no crisis to manage, no emotional temperature to regulate. The body interprets this as loss, not of the partner, but of identity. Without the familiar tension, a quiet question surfaces. If I am not needed in this way, who am I here? This question can feel destabilizing, and so the psyche may subtly sabotage peace, not out of malice, but out of loyalty to a role that once ensured survival. Arguments emerge, distance is created, or attraction quietly fades, explained later as a lack of spark. In reality, the nervous system failed to recognize safety as meaningful. When viewed through this lens, chemistry takes on a different meaning. What feels like magnetism is often recognition. A body remembering an environment it knows how to navigate. An old war map unfolding again, complete with strategies, expectations, and sacrifices. There is no judgment required here, only clarity. These patterns formed for reasons that made sense at the time. They persist because they still offer coherence. But coherence is not the same as truth, and familiarity is not the same as love. As this understanding deepens, something begins to loosen, not immediately and not comfortably. But the moment chemistry is seen as a signal rather than a command, the inner battlefield becomes visible. And what was once mistaken for destiny begins to look like an invitation to integrate something long divided. There is a moment in many adult relationships where nothing is wrong, and yet something feels off. The conversations are steady. The tone is respectful. The days pass without emotional spikes, and instead of relief, there is a strange emptiness. Not dissatisfaction exactly, but a subtle loss of orientation. The body seems to ask, quietly and persistently, what it is supposed to do now. For someone shaped by early instability, calm can register as a loss of control. When the role that once guaranteed belonging disappears, the nervous system doesn't immediately celebrate. It scans. In childhood, control didn't mean dominance. It meant predictability. It meant knowing how to respond quickly enough to prevent rupture. When peace removes that role, the system can feel unneeded, even unsafe. Neuroscience helps clarify this without reducing it to pathology. Unpredictability increases dopamine. It sharpens focus, mobilizes energy, and creates a sense of aliveness. When love and stress were paired early, the chemistry becomes confusing. Oxytocin, the hormone associated with bonding, doesn't distinguish cleanly between safety and intensity. The body remembers connection arriving through tension. Calm, by contrast, offers fewer signals. It can feel flat, even though it is stable. This is where a painful misunderstanding often takes root. Chaos feels like home not because it is good, but because it is known. The nervous system recognizes its cues, the timing, the escalation, the repair. Peace requires a different kind of presence. It asks the system to downshift without losing itself. For someone whose identity was built around tension, this downshift can feel like erasure. Healing, at this stage, rarely feels like relief. It often feels like grief. Grief for the version of the self that knew exactly how to matter. Grief for the clarity that came with crisis. When tension structured belonging, calm can feel like exile. This is why many people abandon healthier dynamics, not out of self-sabotage, but out of disorientation. The old identity no longer fits, and the new one has not yet taken shape. You may notice this in the body before it becomes a thought, a restlessness in quiet moments, a subtle urge to create friction, or a sense that something essential is missing, even when companionship is present. These sensations are not instructions, they are information. They reveal how deeply the nervous system associates meaning with activation. As this pattern settles into the body, the mind begins to build explanations around it. Stories form that make discomfort feel justified. Beliefs emerge that protect the old arrangement. They sound reasonable, they sound moral, and they feel true because they reduce anxiety in the short term. This midpoint is uncomfortable by design. It is where the old logic begins to fail, but the new one is not yet embodied. Staying here requires tolerating ambiguity without rushing to fix it, not to force peace to feel exciting, and not to condemn oneself for missing intensity, just to notice how deeply the body equates tension with belonging. What follows is not an argument against care or responsibility. It is an examination of the belief system that grows around this nervous system pattern, quietly defending it as truth. That confrontation comes next. When a pattern has lived in the body for decades, it rarely survives on sensation alone. The mind steps in to protect it, not maliciously and not consciously, but efficiently. Beliefs form that explain why things must remain the way they are. These beliefs don't announce themselves as defenses. They present as clarity, as realism, as wisdom earned through experience. One belief appears again and again beneath relationship strain. If I don't manage the relationship, it will fall apart. On the surface, this sounds responsible, even loving. It frames vigilance as care, control as commitment. But underneath it lives a much older fear, a memory that connection was once fragile, and that absence of effort led to loss. The belief doesn't ask whether that memory still applies. It simply preserves the role that once kept the system intact. Jung described this process through the lens of the shadow, not as something immoral, but as a collection of strategies that operate outside conscious awareness. These strategies often recruit rational thought to stay hidden. Modern psychology echoes this through what Daniel Kahneman described as the mind's bias toward coherence. We prefer stories that feel internally consistent, especially when they reduce anxiety. A belief that justifies control can feel true because it prevents the body from encountering unresolved grief. This is where power quietly substitutes for mourning. Control postpones grief by keeping the old structure in place. The effort required to maintain stability replaces the vulnerability of admitting how much was lost. Machiavelli, writing about power long before modern psychology, observed that control often compensates for inner instability. When the internal ground feels uncertain, managing the external world becomes seductive. It creates the illusion of safety through dominance of outcome. Culture reinforces this logic through familiar archetypes. The fixer hero, the one who holds everyone together, the man whose value lies in solving, stabilizing, rescuing. These figures are admired until the moment no one needs saving. At that point, the identity collapses. Without a crisis, the role has no anchor. What looked like strength reveals its dependency on dysfunction. These beliefs tend to persist until the cost becomes undeniable. Exhaustion, resentment, a quiet loneliness, even inside partnership, or the repeated experience of being chosen for what one provides rather than who one is. None of this immediately dismantles the belief. Often it hardens it. The mind insists that more effort is required, not less, that the answer lies in better management, not a different orientation. What makes these beliefs so durable is that they once worked. They reduced chaos. They preserved connection. They offered a sense of purpose. Letting them go can feel like betraying the very mechanisms that ensured survival. And so, the psyche defends them with moral language, responsibility, loyalty, commitment. These are not false values. They are simply being asked to carry weight they were never meant to hold alone. At this stage, insight alone is insufficient. The belief system is intertwined with identity. Questioning it doesn't feel like curiosity. It feels like risk. And yet, something subtle begins to shift when the cost is named without judgment. When control is seen not as virtue or vice, but as grief postponed. When effort is recognized as a substitute for safety, rather than a measure of love. This prepares the ground for a deeper transition, one that does not involve rejecting the past or condemning the role that once kept things together. Instead, it invites a reorientation of loyalty itself, away from managing outcomes and towards something quieter and more difficult to sustain, inner alignment. There comes a quiet moment, often unnoticed by others, when the old structure begins to fail internally, not dramatically, not with anger or rebellion, more like a fatigue that no amount of effort resolves. The familiar strategies still function, but they no longer satisfy. Holding things together starts to feel heavier than it used to, as if the body is signaling that something essential has been postponed long enough. At this stage, a hidden conflict tends to surface. Prioritizing the self does not feel neutral. It carries guilt, not the kind tied to wrongdoing, but a deeper, more ambiguous guilt that feels like betrayal. Betrayal of family history, of sacrifices made, of roles inherited without consent. Turning inward can feel like turning away from something sacred, even when no one is asking for continued self-erasure. Jung described individuation not as self-absorption, but as an ethical act. In everyday terms, it is the process of becoming responsible for one's own inner life, rather than outsourcing that responsibility to roles, relationships, or expectations. Viktor Frankl echoed this idea from a different angle, suggesting that meaning emerges when responsibility changes direction. Not disappears, but reorients. The question shifts from, how do I keep this together, to what is mine to carry now? This shift is rarely comfortable. Boundaries, when first contemplated, can feel cold or dangerous, especially for those whose sense of goodness was tied to availability. Yet boundaries do not harden the heart. They restore choice. They make it possible to love without strategy, to offer presence without losing shape. When care is no longer fused with self-abandonment, something new becomes possible. Clinicians who work with adult men shaped by early family division often observe a similar pattern. Stability in relationships begins to emerge only after these men tolerate the discomfort of not rescuing. The urge to fix still arises, but it is no longer obeyed automatically. There is a pause. In that pause, anxiety surfaces, so does guilt. And beneath both, a quieter sensation begins to form. Relief, mixed with unfamiliar freedom. This is not a rejection of loyalty. It is a refinement of it. Loyalty shifts inward, not in opposition to others, but in recognition that a divided inner home cannot sustain intimacy indefinitely. When inner alignment becomes the reference point, relationships are no longer arenas for proving worth or preventing loss. They become spaces of encounter. This transition does not erase the past. It integrates it. The skills learned in childhood, attunement, responsibility, sensitivity, remain valuable. What changes is their governance. They move from being compulsory to being chosen, from survival code to conscious capacity. As this inner shift stabilizes, the ground is prepared for something deeper than withdrawal or retaliation. Integration becomes possible, not a settling of scores, and not a declaration of independence, but a reunion of parts that were once divided by necessity. The final chapter speaks to that reunion, and to what it means to live from an inner home that no longer needs to split itself to belong. There is an image that often helps bring this journey into focus. Imagine a house that was split down the middle early on. 2 entrances, 2 sets of rules, rooms kept intact, but never fully connected. For years, the task was survival, moving quickly between spaces, keeping the structure standing, preventing collapse. Integration is not about choosing which side was right. It is about repairing the house from the inside, so movement is no longer driven by fear of separation. When the pattern is finally named, something important happens. Shame begins to loosen. Not because responsibility disappears, but because context arrives. What once looked like personal deficiency starts to read as intelligent adaptation. The psyche did what it had to do with the information and resources available at the time. Seeing this clearly does not excuse harm done later, but it does dissolve the belief that the self was fundamentally flawed. As the inner home reunites, relationships change their meaning. They are no longer chosen to replay old contracts or to stabilize inherited fractures. They are chosen from alignment, from resonance rather than recognition. The nervous system begins to associate calm with presence instead of loss. Peace stops feeling empty and starts feeling inhabited. This does not create a perfect life. It creates a more honest one. Old reflexes still arise. Sensitivity remains. Care remains. What changes is the center they orbit. Instead of revolving around preventing abandonment, they begin to revolve around coherence. The self no longer needs to split to stay connected. Many men describe this phase not as triumph, but as quiet solidity, less urgency, fewer internal negotiations, a growing ability to remain present without managing the room. Love becomes less strategic, more direct, not because effort vanished, but because effort is no longer compensating for an old absence. If parts of this conversation mapped onto your own experience, even faintly, that recognition matters. Patterns lose their grip when they are seen without contempt. One signal noticed, one thread connected, is often enough to begin a different relationship with the self. This is how the inner home is reunited. Not by rewriting the past, but by inhabiting the present without division. When loyalty no longer pulls the psyche in opposing directions, something simple and powerful becomes possible: to belong to oneself, and from there to meet others without needing to disappear.